Welcome, everyone, and thank you for joining us again for another edition of Battlefield Tours with Rob Woolsey. Today's Battlefield Tour, we are traveling to the Advance on the Northern Front, the Netherlands campaign. So, Rob Woolsey will be presenting our travel forum for today, and I hope you can join us for next month's one. So, I'll leave it off to Rob and have a good evening.
Thank you very much, Mickey. And hello and good evening, everyone. As Mickey said, my name is Rob Woolsey. I'm a member of the Guild of Battlefield Guides, and I am the owner, operator, and guide for Woolsey's War Walks, which is a Canadian-based battlefield tour company. And what we're going to be talking about today is one of the campaigns that the Canadians fought in the Second World War that most people don't know a great deal about. And what we're going to be talking about is the Advance on the Northern Front, the Netherlands campaign, which takes place between the 1st of April and about the 25th of April is kind of when the cutoff for this campaign is called. And it's some of the most interesting battles and most rapid advances for the Canadians in the Second World War. But it's also almost like a sideshow because it takes place while the other allies are charging into Germany. We're cleaning up the Netherlands. So it's an interesting battle. This is a photo on the presentation. You'll see the colors, of course, on the side are each of the divisional colors of the 1st Canadian Army, 1st, 2nd, 3rd, 4th, and 5th divisions. And we're going to be actually talking about all five and why they are together for the first and only time in the war. The photo in the background is the North Nova Scotia Highlanders entering the town and parading around, helping celebrate the liberation. So MFS Europe isn't affiliated with anything I talk about or any of the companies that I mention or anything like that. And they don't sponsor or endorse or anything like that that I name in the presentation. Those are my recommendations to you as an experienced guide in this area. So what we're going to talk about, we're going to be talking kind of a quick overview of what we're going to be seeing in the battle itself, some recommended preparations, travel advisories, some helpful hints that are important. And then we're going to talk about the 2nd Canadian Corps first. This is the same corps that fought from Normandy all the way now to the Netherlands. And if you were here last month, you heard about their attack across the River Rhine, which is where we're going to basically we start at the end of that action. We're going to talk about specifically the kind of the overall picture of that, Zutphen and Deventer, and then the Battle of Groningen, and touching a little bit on the 4th Canadian Armored Division's charge into Germany. And then we're going to talk about the 1st Canadian Corps, who's now just moved up from Italy and into Northwestern Europe, and their actions in Western Netherlands. And then a few other things that are worth talking about. The photo in this part of the presentation, that's the North Shore Regiment making their advance towards Zutphen. So what country are we talking about? Well, we're actually almost all in the Netherlands. There's a little bit of action in Germany at the very, very end of this action, but we're talking in the regions of Gelderland, Overijssel, Drenthe, Groningen, and Friesland. And those are all the regions in the Netherlands that are liberated in this massive, massive drive. The local population today is a little over 5 million people in all five of those areas combined. And of course, they speak Dutch, although there's a version of Friesland, which is a local kind of dialect that's also spoken in that state. The closest major international airport and most convenient is Amsterdam Schiphol Airport under code AMS. So this area has been actually known since Roman times and was actually under the control of the Spanish at one point. But it became its own states because it wasn't just one kingdom in 1581. And it's changed its name and form of government several times over the centuries. In 1848, it became a constitutional monarchy that we see it today. Part of the country was carved off to help form Belgium, actually. And it wasn't involved in the First World War. It was a neutral and sold weapons to both sides and took Allied soldiers in and was used as kind of like a neutral third party. But in the Second World War, of course, it was rapidly invaded by the Nazis in 1940 and was occupied them from 1940 to 1945 and was the scene of some serious battles in 1945. The Netherlands is the 10th most expensive country in Europe, so it's a little bit more pricey than, say, Germany or others, but it is what it is. It's still pretty reasonable compared to some. And it's also known by the name the Low Countries, and you'll hear that in lots of Second World War British literature because it's a literal translation from the French maps of the Pays-Bas. And that's because 26% of the country is below sea level. It is also the most densely populated country in the world, which is remarkably humorous. It's got a population of about 18 million people in total, and they're packed into 33,500 square kilometers, or basically 535 people per square kilometer. To give you context, Canada is one person for every 4.5 kilometers. So a completely opposite comparison. It's a very, very densely populated, packed in country. So recommended preparations. So the Netherlands has generally got a mild climate. The winters are very cool and wet. Most of it is underwater, so the fields are very wet a lot of the time. And it's got some warm, dryish type summer conditions. The coast can be quite breezy, and we're going to be talking about the North Sea and places like that in this action. Really, you want to travel towards the end of April when things start to dry out until no later than the end of October, especially on the coastal areas because it gets quite wet. And because of that, always bring a rain jacket. Every time I go to the Netherlands to do a tour, I get rained on. It could be me, but it's important. It also helps break the wind, and you'll definitely want good footwear. A lot of the places that you're going to see, there'll be bunker remains, fortification remains, and just good footwear. It's not flip-flop type country. Always have insurance when you're traveling. You never know. There are lots of hospitals around. Groningen, Deventer, Amsterdam, of course, has several hospitals. Emmerich in Germany, which is actually close to where we're going to be starting today. Most of the places have hospitals, but again, have insurance because you're going to need that if you get injured. And everything is child friendly. Most of the restaurants are very child friendly. The memorials and the cemetery you'll find will be very child friendly. I've never really had a problem with that. They're also pet friendly in a lot of places as well. The picture on this slide, that is the Royal Hamilton Light Infantry on a kangaroo, actually, an armored infantry personnel carrier driving forward as part of the advance. So always do the travel advice. Look at the Government of Canada travel advisories when you're going anywhere. Of course, there's no COVID restrictions anymore, but there's still some statements on that, but just something to be prepared of. There's no visa requirements for going in, but there is a maximum 90-day stay, of course, if you're coming from Canada. Petty crime is safe. Oh, there was a mistake there. Netherlands is generally considered quite safe, and there are hospitals all over the place. 112 is your emergency number, and the closest consulate is The Hague. So, the battlefield tour we're talking about today is a bit of a challenge because it's more of a driving type tour. You have to kind of have to drive to locations because the distances of this campaign are significant. This is the 2nd Canadian Corps map. You will also see the American 9th Army and the British 2nd Army, which are the dotted line colors below, red being, of course, British, green being the Americans. And this is northeastern the Netherlands and getting into a little bit of Western Germany on this map. There are memorials, there are plaques, there are parks, there are vehicle monuments, but sometimes they're kind of hard to find because they're quite small. It's not as celebrated is the best way to describe how we see this tour. So when you're going there, for sure, there's bridges named for Canada or Canadians in general. One of them being Deventer has a bridge named for a Canadian. There's a kangaroo in Utrecht. There's a tank in Duisburg. So there are things around, and there are lots of bunker remains. They're just kind of, you'll be driving around and you'll see them, or the houses will have plaques on them. And so sometimes finding those can be a little bit challenging. So that's the one thing I can tell you about this tour is a bit of a challenge, is that. But you can also choose to follow a specific division or brigade or battalion on their advance because there's 3 Canadian divisions fighting this campaign, and you can literally follow them all the way up, and kind of take your pick where you want to follow and travel and bounce between the lot of them. So it's really quite interesting. There's also no specific guidebooks for this campaign, Canadian or otherwise. So that also can be a challenge sometimes when you're trying to find some out. Terry Kopp has a really good one that I recommend. It's actually of all the battlefields of Belgium and the Netherlands, so it's not super detailed, but you can get some pretty good stuff out of it. And this is also a campaign where there's not a lot of heavy fighting. There are casualties and there are battles, but we're at the point in the Second World War where the Germans are pretty much all but spent, and they're not defending Germany. We're fighting in the Netherlands, and so they're fighting and they're defending and they're trying to slow down the Allies and inflict casualties, but they're not sticking around and being as tenacious. The defense is essentially starting to break, and the Germans are literally starting to collapse and crumble under the blows that are being hit by them. And they were relatively quick to fall back or surrender when they got hammered by the Allies. We're entering the twilight of the Second World War in Europe, and the Allies are now also starting to get really frustrated that the Germans are just not giving up. We are about to end the strategic bombing campaign. They've just firebombed Dresden. We're just at the literal end of the Second World War, and the Allies are getting very, very upset right now because they just don't know why the Germans don't throw in the towel. So on the 1st of April 1945, the 1st Canadian Army began operations across the Rhine as it had its 2nd Canadian Corps already on the far side and was controlling the western half of the 21st Army Group's bridgehead. At the same time as this was going on, the 1st British Corps, which had fought with the 1st Canadian Army since Normandy, was transferred back to the British 2nd Army. And that is because the 1st Canadian Corps formally entered the line after moving up from Italy in Operation Goldflake, and it was now entering the line for the first time in Northwestern Europe campaign. And it was actually going to be the first time that the 1st Canadian Army was fighting together as all 5 Canadian divisions. And the 1st Canadian Corps consists of the 1st Canadian Infantry Division under Harry Foster and the 5th Canadian Armored Division under Bert Hofmeister. And they had a board British division called 49th West Riding. And then the 2nd Canadian Corps consisted of the 3rd Canadian Infantry Division, 2nd Canadian Infantry Division under Major General Matthews, the 3rd Canadian Infantry Division under Major General Kiefler, and then the 4th Canadian Armored Division under Major General Chris Vokes. And then there was an attached Polish Armored Division that joined partway through the action. And all of this is under the command of General Harry Crear. 1st Canadian Corps is under Charles Fuchs, Lieutenant General Charles Fuchs, and 2nd Canadian Corps is under Lieutenant General Guy Simons. And so Harry Crear, the commander of the 1st Canadian Army, on the 2nd of April, gave his orders to his 2 corps commanders, which had them planning and organizing the drive into liberating the Netherlands. The 1st Canadian Corps, under Charles Fuchs, was to work on expanding the bridgehead around Nijmegen and then liberate the town of Arnhem, which was heavily fought over and damaged, and the bridge across the Rhine was destroyed during the Operation Market Garden in September of 1944. So it's quite an infamous battle location. And then they were going to be tasked to liberate the rest of the Western Netherlands. The 2nd Canadian Corps, under Simons, was to head directly north. And they actually borrowed the 1st Canadian Infantry Division to do a river crossing south of the town of Deventer, which we're going to talk about later, so that they could take the Germans in the flank, and that would allow the 1st Canadian Corps to actually be able to punch across. And basically, their whole job of the 1st Canadian Division with 1st Canadian Corps was to slice a line into the Netherlands so that nobody from the western side of the Netherlands could attack the Allies trying to get into Germany. So the 2nd Canadian Corps, of course, was already across the river, and their drive north was already starting to gain momentum. The 2nd Canadian Division had started their drive from the town of Milligan on the 31st of March, 1945, driving northwards with the 6th Canadian Brigade's Fusilier Mont-Royal and the South Saskatchewan Regiment, moving to and along the old Isjul River, and after crossing the German-Dutch border with their left flank covered by the Queen's Own Cameron Highlanders, and then the 5th Brigade's Black Watch across and then up on the other side with the Regiment de Maisonneuve when they got across the river. By the 2nd and 3rd of April, 1945, the 4th Canadian Infantry Brigade crossed the Twent Canal about 4 miles east of the town of Zutphen after a quick 20-mile advance, which they faced no opposition. While the bridges over the canal were destroyed, the defenders were completely surprised by the attack and were completely disorganized, allowing for a rapid, successful crossing of the canal. In fact, the anecdotes from it is that the Germans were so surprised that the pioneers that were getting ready to dig the positions were there, but the defenders weren't there, and they were completely captured by the Canadians, who then took over the positions and quickly captured the German defenders. The 3rd Canadian Infantry Division, of course, after taking Emmerich with the 7th Canadian Infantry Brigade, continued to move in a northeasterly direction with 8th and 9th Brigades leading. The Regiment de la Chaudière moved on the town of Elton, and then a feature called Hoch Elton with the Queen's Own Rifles on their right-hand side, moving through the Stroke-Krumer Bosch, which is staying on the inside of Germany. The North Nova Scotia Highlanders and Stormont, Dundas, and Glengarry Highlanders of 9th Brigade moved to their left of the Queen's Own Rifles, taking on the Dutch side of the same forest, all on the 1st of April. They continued in a northward direction, clearing the bank of the Isgel River, capturing the town of Wheal on the 2nd of April, and then the 8th Brigade secured the town of Doesburg, where there's actually a park named for the Canadians, originally called Fort Garry Park. It is now called Canada Park. And the 7th Brigade then cleared the western end of the Twent Canal, with the 9th Brigade moving up towards Zutphen from the east and the south by the 5th of April. They faced some resistance on the outskirts of the town in the hamlets of Barentsburg and Waldensburg, but they were able to secure these approaches for the next move. Zutphen and Deventer. The 8th Canadian Brigade began their attack on the 6th of April 1945 with the North Shore Regiment and the Regiment de la Chaudière attacking from the east in a two-pronged attack. The North Shore Regiment ran into strong opposition, but the Regiment de la Chaudière made good progress, and soon the North Shore attack was ended, and they were pulled back and then attacked through the Chaudières through the right-hand side to directly fighting north. The fighting in the town continued until on the 7th of April, but the German tenacity was beginning to slacken off, and this was a significant change and noticed by the Canadians. The town finally fell on the 8th of August when 2 Churchill crocodiles were brought up to clear out the factory area, and by midday the town was completely secured, and the surviving defenders were trying to cross the Idgel River in small rubber boats as best as they could. Looking at the map here, you can see Zutphen is the southernmost battle on the map. You can see the town there, and there's a picture of the Regiment de la Chaudière in their attempts to cross the Idgel in some rubber boats, trying to get into. It's actually one of the feedways around the town that they're trying to feed into. The 7th, sorry. While this was happening, the 9th Canadian Brigade, who had moved from the south of Zutphen up, crossed the Shipbeak Canal some 5 miles north of the Twent Canal, and the 7th Brigade were positioning and preparing to attack the town of Deventer, just up the river from Zutphen on the Idgel River. The 7th Brigade attacked Deventer on the evening of the 9th of April, 1945, across the canal on the outskirts of town, with the Canadians Scottish leading. The morning of the 10th saw 3 German tanks try to interrupt the attack, but one was knocked out by supporting tanks of the Sherbrooke Fusilier Regiment's B Squadron. By midday, the main attack into Deventer began by the Canadian, Scottish, and Royal Winnipeg Rifles, and soon all resistance in the town crumbled, with the main part of the town completely secure by that evening. The Regina Rifle Regiment passing through, and they took the rest of the evening to clear the remaining suburbs. And in all, Deventer took 24 hours to capture the entire town at a cost of only 125 casualties. There's a memorial today just at the railroad bridge in Deventer, which you can see the railway line on the map. And there's a memorial there. It's actually a German anti-tank gun that has all the units and battle honors and battles that were fought in the area on it. And so the photo, you see the North Shore Regiment there. They're clearing one of the roads near Zutphen. The next day, the 1st Canadian Brigade of the 1st Canadian Division, sorry, my apologies. Operation Cannon Shot was the next phase, which is actually the code name for the 1st Canadian Infantry Division's crossing of the Idgel River, and it was launched by the 2nd Brigade in its first battle in Northwest Europe on the afternoon of the 11th of April, 1945, led by the Seaforth Highlanders and the Princess Patricia's Canadian Light Infantry, using Buffalo landing track vehicles for the first time. From the start until they secured their objectives was a little over 2.5 hours, between 4:30 and 6 p.m., and they secured them completely and allowed the 5 companies of engineers to start rapidly bridging the river. And the top right-hand photo is the PPCLI loading into those vehicles to start the attack. The next day, the 1st Brigade passed through and attacking towards the city of Apeldoorn. And in the fighting, the CO of the 48th Highlanders, Lieutenant Colonel D.A. Mackenzie, was killed in action by enemy shellfire. The 3rd Brigade crossed the river following the 1st Brigade, widening the front and making good progress, so much so that by 6 a.m. on the 13th of April, they were about halfway to the city of Apeldoorn, and they reverted back to 1st Canadian Corps Command. The 2nd Canadian Division launched a huge drive towards the North Sea when its 6th Brigade reached the Ship Beak Canal about 8 miles east of Devontor, quickly crossed it, being led by the Queen's Own Cameron Highlanders, and the next day drove on towards the town of Holton, which the 5th Brigade took on the 8th of April, and then they took the town of Omanen on the 11th of April. And Holton is a pretty important town because that's where the Canadian cemetery, the last of the war to be founded, is found today. The Fusilier Mont-Royal found a canal bridge completely intact and swung around behind the town of Billion, taking it in a quick and rapid surprise attack, with the defenders not realizing they were ambushed. They continued towards the city of Groningen, and on the evening of the 13th of April, they were fighting in the outskirts of the city. The resistance was tough, and soon all 3 brigades of the 2nd Canadian Division were fighting in the city, which eventually fell on the 16th of April at a cost of 209 casualties. In the 16 days since the start of the attack, the 2nd Canadian Division had advanced 112 miles and were on the North Sea coast. And this is one of the things that's actually going to be a bit of a challenge for the Canadians. In the photo on the right-hand side are men of the Essex Scottish guarding the streets in Groningen on the 14th of April, 1945, and you're going to see there's civilians in the background. This was a problem. The civilians would come out and celebrate their liberation while the Canadians are trying to clear the Germans out. It was a non-stop challenge, and they actually helped slow down the advance of the Canadians at times because the locals were just thrilled to death to be liberated. To the left of the 2nd, the 3rd Canadian Division, after clearing Devontor, kept on moving towards the town of Leeuwarden, about 70 miles north of Devontor, taking Zwolle along the way and reaching Leeuwarden on the 15th of April. And their 26-day advance, because they started on the other side of the river, the Rhine River, they'd covered 115 miles. The last of the major units to fight was the 4th Canadian Armored Division, which had also crossed the Rhine and moved across the frontier, and then were preparing for a northeastern drive, and they also crossed the Twent Canal in 2 actions. One was made under enemy fire, and one made by the Lake Superior Regiment, who were supposed to launch a diversion about 1,000 yards away from the main crossing, and they found a lock that only had a small 30-yard gap in it, which was easily crossed and then rapidly bridged, allowing for the tanks and heavy vehicles of the Armored Division to keep going forward. Resistance began to slacken and allowed the liberation of Delden, Born, and Almelo, about 8 miles north of the canal, driving the Germans back across their border in this area. They continued and captured the outskirts of Meppen in Germany on the 6th of April, and then, after crossing the River Ems, quickly took the town with only 1 casualty. Sogel was cleared on the 9th, and then Berger. The next objection was the town of Freyzwijk, which was captured on the 14th of April, after a rest and reset by the Argyll and Sutherland Highlanders, whose commanding officer was killed. His name was Lieutenant Colonel F.E. Wiggle, to a counterattack by some Germans that had been bypassed, and those Germans ambushed his headquarters, and he was killed. In retaliation, and due to a rumor because of civilian sniping at him and German civilian sniping in general, the whole town was burned in reprisal by the Canadians. It was supposedly ordered by Major General Chris Folks, the divisional commander, who, when he was told of the death of Wiggle, who was a friend of his, he was very openly upset and ordered the town be fired. And so they evacuated as many of the civilians out as they could, didn't give them much time, and they burned the town to the ground. Some people consider that a war crime. It wasn't investigated as such, but it was a very serious mark on the Canadians. Now to the 1st Canadian Corps. 1st Canadian Corps in the Western Netherlands. Operation Destroyer was the first of the 1st Canadian Corps operations to liberate the Western Netherlands. It started on the 2nd of April with the 5th Canadian Armored Division's move against the Germans just north of Nijmegen, with the aim of clearing the area between Nijmegen and the Nieder-Rhine River with the support of the British 49th West Riding Division. And then they were to support the 49th West Riding Division as they crossed the river and attacked into this town of Arnhem itself. On the 2nd of April, the attack began with the 11th Canadian Infantry Brigade of 5th Armored Division, working its way towards the Nieder-Rhine, starting at dusk and generally facing minimal opposition, mostly running into mines and craters, except for the Perth Regiment, who had to push off 2 German counterattacks that were half-heartedly made. But they made it all to the riverbank by the 3rd of April, 1945. The next phase, the taking of Arnhem itself, was called Operation Anger, which had to be delayed due to some ground conditions, flooding and water, and the need for Operation Cannon Shot, which we talked about earlier, which is the 1st Canadian Division attack across the Ijl River, to be successful, which it was on the 11th of April. During the delay, the 1st Canadian Armored Brigade, with 2 attached Belgian battle groups, replaced the 5th Armored Division on the south bank of the Rhine, and the 5th Armored Division moved across the Rhine at Emmerich, and then moved into position with the 49th West Riding Division and its 56th Brigade to an area just east of Arnhem on the north side of the river. Spitfires and Typhoons of the 2nd Tactical Air Force attacked Arnhem on the afternoon of the 12th of April, and actions by the 1st Canadian Corps near the town of Driel occupied the Germans' attention, followed by the warming up of a bombardment starting early in the evening, all made the infantry attack by the 56th Brigade across a tributary of the Ijl southeast of the town in their buffaloes much, much easier. They penetrated the southeastern outskirts of Arnhem quite easily and repulsed a German counterattack, securing their bridgehead. And by the evening of the 13th of April, the town of Arnhem was all but cleared with the help from the Ontario Regiment's tanks. The 1st Canadian Corps' next phase was to clear the rest of the Western Netherlands. The 49th West Riding headed towards the town of Utrecht, and the 5th Canadian Armored Division was to charge on towards Amersfoort, and the 1st Canadian Infantry Division was to move on Gouda, The Hague, and then Rotterdam. The challenge was that the 1st Canadian Infantry Division's attack on Apeldoorn was meeting increasing resistance from German defenders, and so Lieutenant General Fuchs ordered the 5th Armored Division to pass through Arnhem with the goal of advancing some 30 miles to the Ijlsmeer, which is the lake at the very top of the map in the center. That's also the lake. Amsterdam is also on that body of water. Liberating Otterloo, Barneveld, Voorthuizen, and Putten en route. Codenamed Operation Cleanser, it would also pass part of the action to 2nd Canadian Corps. The 1st Canadian Division would continue its drive onto Apeldoorn and then advance parallel to the 5th Armored Division until about halfway to the town of Barneveld, where the 1st Division would take over part of the advance, and the 5th Armored Division would be tasked to 2nd Canadian Corps. The 1st Canadian Infantry Division finally launched their attack onto Apeldoorn on the 16th of April after days of heavy fighting, and that night the defenders broke and quietly departed the town, and quiet descended. Moving quickly, the Royal Canadian Regiment secured the eastern part of the town at 4:30 in the morning and were followed through by the 48th Highlanders, who had the northwestern section of the town secured by mid-morning, and by noon the center of the town was held by the Royals. The Hastings Prince Edward Regiment took the traditional summer palace of the Dutch royal family without a shot. The battles from the 11th to the 17th of April cost the 1st Canadian Division 507 casualties, but there was to be no pause, as the division then had to move up to Barneveld to link up with the 5th Armored Division. Operation Cleanser was to be an armored thrust and began at 6:30 a.m. on the 15th of April. With the British Columbia Dragoons and the 8th Canadian Hussars, who rapidly took their objectives, the town of Terrelet and Deline. My apologies. The second phase had the Lord Strathcona's horse pass through and move into the town of Otterloo, but they were unable to reach it before nightfall. But they did make it early the next morning and then continued to advance to Barveld, which they bypassed after meeting some resistance, and then kept on charging towards Voorthuizen. But they ended that day just short of that objective as well. The British Columbia Dragoons went around on the other side and attacked Voorthuizen and cut the Apeldoorn-Amersfoort road by the evening of the 16th of April. The urgency to meet their objectives and the Germans' rush to escape led to some fierce actions, one being called, in quotations, the Battle of Otterloo, on the night of 17th of April, when the Germans who were trying to escape made for escape Amersfoort. Yes, Amersfoort. Tried to break out and ended up trying to get their way through Otterloo, which was also the location of the 5th Canadian Armored Division headquarters, plus the 2nd Canadian Irish Regiment, plus 2 artillery units, one of them being the 17th Field Regiment, and the other a battery from the 3rd Medium Regiment. Shortly after midnight, the Germans came charging into the town, screaming, yelling, and shooting their weapons, and soon developed into a general melee, with the Irish and the gunners taking a brunt of the fighting. Firing over open sights, the artillery were heavily engaged, but at dawn, the Irish regiment formed up and counterattacked with Wasp flamethrowers lending a hand, and by mid-morning, the entire action was over, with 300 German dead, with only a loss of 47 Canadians. The Cape Breton Highlanders took the town of Barnesfeld about the same time as the Irish were defending Waterloo, and the drive to Putin continued, but with significant losses in tanks as they got closer to their objectives. The day ended with the Canadians just short of the town. The morning of the 18th of April, 1945, the 8th Canadian Hussars and the Westminster Regiment broke into the town, and by 10:30, they'd gotten as far as the Ijlmere, that lake at the north, and Operation Cleanser was declared over. The 1st Canadian Corps now settled into a quiet as they cleaned up their lines, cleaned up the back rear area pockets, and secured their lines. And they made for the River Ems, but that was it. Their war was essentially over on the 25th of April, 1945, as there were to be no more advances and distractions into the Western Netherlands. So this is, there's no maps of that advance. It was really surprising in the official history. It was really quite not talked about. Even the Battle of Waterloo. I actually took a lot of the Battle of Waterloo from a family tour I'm working on because they were actually heavily engaged. So the right-hand photo is a Private Goddard of the Perth Regiment. He did survive the war. That's him just north of Arnhem as they're starting their drive north. The men of the Irish Regiment are in the center. That's actually at one of the roadblocks in Waterloo. That's post-battle. And they seem pretty relaxed for guys that supposedly got almost overrun by the Germans. And the other one is civilians on a Sherman tank of the Lord Strathcona's horse, celebrating their liberation, which was quite a thing. So to visit the fallen for all of these actions that we've talked about today, they're all commemorated in Holton Canadian War Cemetery, which has a total of 1,393 Canadians in it. The area was liberated, as said, by the Black Watch of the 2nd Canadian Division. Even the casualties sustained inside of Germany were all brought back here because the 1st Canadian Army commander ordered that none of his troops would be buried in foreign soil. So the next move for the Canadians in the Second World War is going to be, in the last 2 weeks of the war, we're going to cover next month as we're talking about the end of the campaign and the Canadians drive into Germany. I hope you very much enjoyed the talk we did about the liberation of the Netherlands today. Thank you very much.
I'd like to thank everybody for joining us today. I hope you can join us next month for another battlefield tour. The next one is The End of War, Final Canadian Operation in Europe. I have a feeling it's going to be a big one. And Rob, would you like to give us a little teaser for next month, sorry?
Yeah, we're going to be talking about the last 2 weeks of the war for Canada. And the last big moves that we start making actually into Germany. So 1st Canadian Corps, of course, stays in the Netherlands and secures all that. But the rest of the Canadians, 2nd Canadian Corps, start driving into Germany itself and fighting on German soil for real in the invasion of Germany. And it's the last bitter fights. And one point I didn't raise in this one, the campaign that we talked about today was really the first major campaign that they started an Operation Veritable. But this is where a majority of the conscripts that do serve in the Second World War fight in the battles we talked about today, and we're going to talk about next month. So it's actually quite a period of rapid advance for the Canadians, and some of the most heartbreaking losses because the Germans are at the very end and soldiers are dying right up until the very last day of the war. And we're also going to talk about the surrender of the Germans in the Netherlands, which happens to take place at the same time, to a Canadian general, no less.
Well, hopefully you can all join us for next month's edition. I see Katie. I like that it was truly a Canadian effort from all areas of the country. I didn't realize that before.
Yep, it's the very first time that every Canadian division is fighting at the same time in the same place under a Canadian command. It's the most amount of time, most troops that any commander has ever commanded is this campaign, and is by General Harry Crerar.
Huh. Oh, yeah, I didn't realize that either.
Yeah, most people don't. It's like the Vimy Ridge of the Second World War. It just took until the last month of the war.
I guess we'll see you on our next battlefield tour. And if you like these, we have a full list of playlists on YouTube about this with the incredible Rob Woolsey. We're so thank you for you, grateful for you again. So thank you for doing these.
Oh, my pleasure.
And I'm wishing you all a very nice day.
Have a wonderful evening, everyone.